In 1982, a single company in Rochester, New York, employed 60,000 people. 60,000. That was more than the entire population of the city when it got its first nickname, the Young Lion of the West. The company was Eastman Kodak, and by the time it filed for bankruptcy in January 2012, its local workforce had fallen below 5,000. But this is not a story about a company dying. This is a story about what a city was before it needed saving. Start with a purchase. On November 8, 1803, three men from Hagerstown, Maryland, Colonel Nathaniel Rochester, Major Charles Carroll, and Colonel William Fitzhugh, signed an agreement for 100 acres along the Genesee River in western New York. They paid $1,750 on a 5-year land contract for a tract that included an abandoned grist and sawmill near the river's upper falls. The men were land speculators, not dreamers, and what they saw in those falls was not beauty but force. 3 cataracts on the Genesee, each one a source of raw mechanical power, enough to drive mills and grinders and anything else you could bolt to a water wheel. The 100-acre tract had changed hands several times since a frontiersman named Ebenezer Indian Allen built the first mill there in 1789. Allen couldn't find enough customers and walked away. The land passed through 4 different owners before the Maryland trio picked it up. Nathaniel Rochester didn't arrive in person until 1810. He was 58 years old, a Revolutionary War veteran, a former sheriff, a banker, a man who had spent 30 years in Maryland running flour mills, a nail factory, and a rope works. He understood what water could do to grain. When he finally surveyed the land and laid out streets in 1811, the settlement's total population was 15 people, and a set of falls that dropped 96 feet. The village incorporated as Rochesterville in 1817 with a population of 700. The name was unpopular, too long for a frontier town, and by 1822 people had shortened it to Rochester. That same year, the Erie Canal reached the east side of the Genesee River, and the population had already climbed to 3,130. What happened next turned a muddy village into what many considered America's first genuine boomtown. The Erie Canal changed the math of flour. Before the canal, shipping grain from western New York to the Atlantic seaboard meant risking the unpredictable waters of Lake Ontario and a long, expensive overland route. The canal cut travel time in half and dropped shipping rates by 94%. Rochester sat at the intersection of the river's water power and the canal's reach, and the flour mills multiplied. In the first 10 days, the canal was open east to the Hudson. 40,000 barrels of Rochester flour were shipped to Albany and New York City, 3,600 tons of it, pouring out of the mills along the Genesee like a white river feeding into the blue one. By 1830, the population had reached 9,200. By 1834, some 20 flour mills were producing 500,000 barrels of flour annually, and Rochester was rechartered as a city. Jonathan Child, son-in-law of old Colonel Rochester, became its first mayor. The city area had expanded to 4,000 acres. Rochester millers were grinding 25,000 bushels of wheat a day, and the money followed the flour. A 2-story brick courthouse in the Greek Revival style went up for $7,600. Boatyards opened along the canal to build the vessels that would carry the product east. The whole enterprise was a machine, and every part of it, the falls, the mills, the canal, the boats, fed the next. There is a story, never quite confirmed, that in 1847 a Rochester miller named Chappell shipped 3 specially milled barrels of fine flour to Queen Victoria, each wrapped in canvas and packed in custom-made casks. Whether Victoria actually preferred Rochester flour for her cakes, as the legend claims, is a matter of some debate among local historians. But Rochester millers did send flour to the Crystal Palace at the first World's Fair in London in 1851, and no one disputed the quality. By 1838, Rochester was the largest flour-producing city in the United States. But the flour era contained its own expiration date. Westward expansion was pushing the center of wheat farming toward the Great Plains, and by the 1850s, poor harvests from drought and insects were hitting local crops. Rochester kept milling, Over 1.5 million barrels shipped in 1901, but the title of Flower City had already begun to feel like a memory. Minneapolis took the crown. Something else, though, was growing in the spaces the flower trade left behind. The transition was literal. Where flour mills had lined the Genesee, nurseries began to spread across the surrounding landscape. A man named William Reynolds had started a seed business, and by mid-century, several Rochester seed companies had grown to become among the largest in the world. Ellwanger and Barry, founded on South Avenue, became the biggest nursery operation in the country, drawing tourists to see its grounds. Rochester's nickname shifted from the Flower City to the Flower City, and the logo eventually incorporated both, the spokes of a mill wheel and the petals of a bloom. But the real transformation of Rochester, the thing that would define it for more than a century, started with a bank clerk who couldn't afford a vacation. In 1878, a 23-year-old named George Eastman, earning a modest salary at the Rochester Savings Bank, planned a trip to Santo Domingo. A colleague suggested he bring a camera. Eastman bought the full photographic outfit of the era: wet plates, glass, chemicals, a tripod, a tent for developing. The equipment alone weighed as much as a small trunk. He never made the trip, but he became obsessed with photography, and specifically with the question of why it had to be so complicated. Eastman spent 3 years experimenting with gelatin emulsions in his mother's kitchen. By 1880, he had invented and patented a machine for coating dry photographic plates, eliminating the need for photographers to prepare their own chemicals on the spot. In April of that year, he leased the 3rd floor of a building on State Street in downtown Rochester and started manufacturing dry plates for sale. One of his first purchases was a second-hand engine for $125. He later recalled, "I really needed only a 1 horsepower. This was a 2 horsepower, but I thought perhaps business would grow up to it." It did. In 1881, with financial backing from Rochester businessman Henry Strong, Eastman formed the Eastman Dry Plate Company. By 1888, he had patented the Kodak camera, a word he invented because he liked the letter K, thought it was strong and incisive, and wanted a name that was short, easy to pronounce, and not associated with anything else. The camera sold for $25, preloaded with enough film for 100 exposures. When the roll was used up, the customer mailed the entire camera back to Rochester, where the film was developed, prints were made, and new film was loaded, all for $10. Eastman coined the slogan himself: "You press the button, we do the rest." Within a year, it was a phrase known across the country. In 1892, the company was reincorporated as Eastman Kodak. In 1900, Eastman introduced the Brownie, a simple box camera that cost $1, making photography something a child could do. And the money began to pour into Rochester in a way that Flower never had. The Kodak Tower, designed by Howard Wright Cutler and Gordon and Kelber architects, rose on State Street beginning in 1912. George Eastman personally oversaw the project. When it was completed in 1914, its 16 stories of French Renaissance terracotta made it the tallest building in Rochester, overtaking the Powers Building, which had held the title since Daniel Powers finished it in 1870. Powers had filled his building with 8 million pounds of iron and 65,000 square feet of Vermont and Italian marble, and he had boasted that it could hold Rochester's entire population of 80,000. But the Kodak Tower was something else. It was a corporate monument, visible from everywhere in the city, a physical fact that said Kodak was Rochester and Rochester was Kodak. And Eastman was not finished. In the late 1920s, when the Genesee Valley Trust Building announced plans for an architectural feature that would threaten the Kodak Tower's status as the city's tallest, Eastman hired an architect to add 3 more stories and a spire. The tower would remain the tallest building in Rochester for over 50 years. The neon Kodak sign on top, glowing red against the night sky, became as much a part of the skyline as the Genesee itself. But Eastman's ambitions for Rochester went far beyond signage. In a 1924 letter, he wrote, "I want to make Rochester, for the thousands of people I have gathered here, the best place on the face of the earth to live in and bring up their families." He meant it, and he spent accordingly. During his lifetime, Eastman donated more than $100 million, the equivalent of roughly $2 billion in today's money, to institutions in Rochester and beyond. He gave $51 million to the University of Rochester, creating its medical school, its School of Dentistry, and in 1921, the Eastman School of Music. A year later, on Labor Day, September 4th, 1922, the Eastman Theater opened on Gibbs Street. Designed by McKim, Mead, and White in collaboration with Rochester's Gordon and Kaelber, the building was Italian Renaissance and neoclassical, clad in gray Indiana limestone and Vermont marble. The main auditorium seated over 2,300, a crystal chandelier from Italy and the Czech Republic, 14 feet in diameter, 35 feet tall, weighing 2.5 tons, illuminated by 546 lights, hung from the ceiling. An inscription carved above the entrance read, "For the enrichment of community life." Inside, the auditorium followed a blue and gold color scheme, decorated with murals, bas-reliefs, and ornamental plasterwork. Maxfield Parrish contributed a large mural for the north stairway. The organ, built by the Austin Organ Company of Hartford, was the largest theater organ ever built at the time, with 229 stops on 4 manuals. Eastman had his reserved seats, front row right in the mezzanine promenade, and he always paid for them, whether he sat in them or not. He also created the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra to serve as the theater's resident ensemble. He built a $2.5 million dental clinic for children. He anonymously donated $20 million to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, requesting that his gift be reported as coming from Mr. Smith. He gave generously to Tuskegee University and Hampton University, 2 historically black colleges, becoming their largest donor of his era, though he simultaneously upheld the de facto segregation that characterized Rochester during his lifetime, with Kodak hiring virtually no black employees while he was alive. Eastman's 50-room colonial revival mansion at 900 East Avenue, designed by J. Foster Warner in consultation with McKim, Mead, and White, took 3 years to complete and included 12.5 acres of working farmland, formal gardens, greenhouses, and stables. East Avenue became Rochester's grandest address. The Eastman House was joined up and down the boulevard by other mansions built on Kodak profits, on Bausch Lomb profits, on the earnings of Hickey Freeman, Adler Brothers, Stein Block, and Sibley, Lindsay and Kerr's department store. It was a street that told you exactly how much money was being made in Rochester and who was making it, because Kodak was not alone. Rochester's industrial ecology in the early 20th century was remarkably dense and self-reinforcing. John Jacob Bausch, a German immigrant who arrived in Rochester in 1850, had opened a tiny optician's shop in the Reynolds Arcade in 1853. He did it with a $60 loan from a friend, a cabinet maker named Henry Laum, and the two became partners. Bausch ground lenses and made horn rim frames by hand. His breakthrough came when he began replacing expensive horn and gold in eyeglass frames with vulcanite, a hard rubber compound. Civil War inflation and shipping blockades drove up the cost of imported materials, making his rubber frames cheaper and in vastly higher demand. By 1860, Bausch and Lomb had built the first spectacle-making machine in America. By 1903, the company employed 1,200 workers, many of them skilled German artisans who formed the core of Rochester's close-knit German community. The factory on St. Paul Street, with 1,874 inches carved over the door, became a landmark of its own. Then there was the garment trade. Rochester's first tailor, Jehiel Barnard, had set up shop in what is now Reynolds Arcade in 1812, the same year as the city's permanent settlement. By 1834, at least 20 tailors were working in the city. By 1848, over 30 garment shops crowded the low wooden structures along the Main Street Bridge and nearby Front Street. The Civil War gave the industry a jolt. Rochester became a major producer of military uniforms. And afterward, demand for ready-made men's suits in the expanding West kept the factories humming. In 1879, some 2,700 workers filled the garment factories daily. By the 1890s, Rochester was the 4th largest manufacturer of men's clothing in America. The names of the firms read like a roll call of American menswear. Michael Stern, founded in the 1840s. Hickey Freeman started in 1899, which built its famous factory, known as the Temple, on North Clinton Avenue in 1912, chosen because a survey showed that most of its skilled workers lived within walking distance. Fashion Park, Bond Clothing Stores, Stein Block, Timely Clothes. In the early 1900s, nearly 200 clothiers, large and small, dotted the Rochester landscape. These factories were an entry point for waves of European immigrants, Italian, Polish, German, Eastern European, who came seeking work and shaped the city's neighborhoods around their places of employment. A massive strike by militant women workers in 1913 was part of a wave of uprisings across the region's needle trades. By 1919, Hickey Freeman workers had unionized, and over the following years, management and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America established what trade unionists called industrial peace, a mutual respect between management and labor that lasted for decades. Picture Rochester on a Saturday evening in, say, 1925. Main Street is electric, the Powers Building anchoring the four corners, its 5 stories of carved sandstone and iron rising over the intersection of Main and State. Sibley, Lindsay, and Kerr's department store, designed by the architect J. Foster Warner, occupies an entire city block at Main and Clinton. 5 acres of floor space behind a facade of brown Roman brick and deeply set Chicago-style windows, topped by a clock tower with Baroque and Renaissance details. The store is the largest between New York City and Chicago, and at the holidays its storefront windows draw families from across the region. Down the street, men in Hickey Freeman suits and women in fur-trimmed coats stroll past the marquee of the Eastman Theater, where the Rochester Philharmonic is performing. The neon Kodak sign glows above the skyline to the north. Streetcars rattle along their tracks, the last of the old transit system that will be partially replaced in 2 years by something stranger, a subway built in the abandoned bed of the Erie Canal. That subway, formerly called the Rochester Industrial and Rapid Transit Railway, opened on December 1, 1927. The Erie Canal had been rerouted south of the city in 1918, declared an eyesore and an obstruction, and the abandoned canal bed offered a grade-separated route for the heavy interurban streetcars that had been clogging surface streets. 2 miles of the route through downtown were built in a cut-and-cover tunnel beneath Broad Street. The rest ran in the open trench of the old canal. The whole thing crossed the Genesee River on the Second Genesee Aqueduct, a stone structure built between 1836 and 1842, which had originally carried canal boats over the river and now carried trolley cars instead. Extensions soon connected to Kodak Park, the sprawling manufacturing complex on the city's north side that was becoming one of the largest industrial facilities on the planet. The subway was plagued from the start. When planning began in 1910, automobiles were a novelty. By the time it opened in 1927, the number of automobiles in Rochester had increased nearly 30 times. The construction bonds would not be paid off until 1960, 4 years after the subway had already shut down. Ridership surged during World War II, reaching nearly 5 million passengers annually by 1945 because gas and tire rationing made private cars impractical. But as soon as the war ended, riders evaporated. The last passenger rode the Rochester subway on June 30, 1956. Parts of the route were then ripped up for Interstate 490. The rest was abandoned, its stations left to decay, its tunnel walls eventually covered in graffiti. The construction bond still had 4 years to run. But in the 1920s, nobody knew any of that. Rochester in the 20s and 30s was a city that believed it had figured something out. Kodak was growing. Bausch Lomb was making not just spectacles, but microscopes, binoculars, and, starting in the 1930s, Ray-Ban aviator goggles for military pilots. The garment industry employed thousands. Frederick Law Olmsted, the architect of Central Park, had designed Rochester's park system, and Highland Park, with its collection of lilacs and its annual festival, drew visitors from across the state. The University of Rochester, founded in 1850, was being transformed by Eastman's money into a serious research institution. The Eastman School of Music, under director Howard Hanson, was becoming one of the finest conservatories in the country. Even the Great Depression didn't break Rochester. Kodak laid off 17% of its employees between 1929 and 1933, but the company participated in the Rochester Plan, a privately funded unemployment insurance program created by Kodak executive Marion Folsom, who later served in Dwight Eisenhower's cabinet, that made payments to the jobless between 1933 and 1936. Rochester's banks managed to stay solvent. The city didn't collapse. It bent. George Eastman did not survive the Depression in the same way his company did. Diagnosed with a progressive and irreversible spinal disease in the late 1920s, he endured years of increasing pain. His walk became a shuffle. On March 14, 1932, at his mansion on East Avenue, he shot himself in the heart. His note read, "To my friends, my work is done. Why wait?" His funeral was held at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, and his remains were buried on the grounds of the company he had founded, at what is now Eastman Business Park. He bequeathed his entire estate to the University of Rochester. At his death, seat number 48 in the Eastman Theater mezzanine, his seat, the one he always paid for, was left empty. The city Eastman left behind continued to grow. Rochester's population reached 332,488 in 1950, its peak, and the industrial base was broader than perhaps any comparable city in America. During the Second World War, Bausch Lomb made rifle scopes, binoculars, and sunglasses for the troops. Kodak started an aerial photography flight school for the military. Wollensack, a camera company founded by a former Bausch Lomb employee, made spotting scopes and precision optical instruments. The Gleason Works produced precision gears and tooling. When the war ended, those technologies and the skilled workers who built them adapted to a peacetime economy without missing a step. And then, in 1946, a small Rochester company called Haloid, founded in 1906 as a manufacturer of photographic paper, made a deal that would change the city again. Haloid's president, Joseph Wilson, had taken over from his father in 1936, and the photographic paper market was shrinking. A physicist named Chester Carlson had invented a process for printing images using an electrically charged drum and dry powder toner, and Wilson agreed to fund the development of the technology in exchange for commercial rights. It took more than a decade to bring the product to market, but in 1959, the Xerox 914, the world's first fully automatic plain paper photocopier, was released. The company, renamed Haloid Xerox in 1958 and then Xerox Corporation in 1961, saw sales skyrocket. Revenue hit nearly $60 million in 1961. By 1965, it exceeded $500 million. The Xerox Tower, completed in 1967, rose to become the tallest building in Rochester, finally unseating the Kodak Tower after more than 50 years. Rochester now had two corporate giants, both headquartered downtown, both household names. This was the apex. If you had to choose a single decade when Rochester was most fully itself, it would be the 1960s. Population still above 300,000. Kodak employing tens of thousands. Xerox booming. Bausch and Lomb expanding. The garment trade still alive. The University of Rochester growing. The Eastman School world-renowned, the parks green and maintained. It was the kind of American city that worked, except it wasn't working for everyone. Rochester's black population had tripled during the 1950s, reaching over 25,000 by 1960, but Kodak and the other major employers had long practiced discriminatory hiring. Most African Americans in Rochester held low-pay, low-skill jobs and lived in substandard housing. In July 1964, Rochester erupted. The three-day riot resulted in 5 deaths, 350 injuries, nearly 1,000 arrests, and 204 stores looted or damaged. The National Guard was called in. It was a shock to a city that thought of itself as orderly and prosperous, and it exposed a fault line that the neon glow of the Kodak sign had done nothing to illuminate. The fault lines kept widening, though slowly, and in ways that were easy not to notice at first. Xerox moved its headquarters from Rochester to Stamford, Connecticut in 1969. The company remained a major employer locally, but the signal was clear. The executive class was leaving. The automobile, which had killed the subway, was now killing the city in a different way, pulling the middle class outward to suburbs with better schools, bigger houses, and quieter streets. Rochester's population, which had peaked at 332,488 in 1950, began a slide that would never reverse. Kodak's local employment peaked at 60,400 in 1982. That number is staggering in retrospect, more than the current workforces of the University of Rochester, Rochester Regional Health, and Wegmans Food Markets combined. A 1989 New York Times article compared Rochester to a company town. Kodak employees behaved like a separate class. A journalist noted that from the cradle, infants were impressed with the fact that Daddy is a Kodak man, and the implication was the same as being told, our father is a 33rd degree Mason. The company's turnover rate in the 1950s was only 13% compared to 50% for American manufacturers overall. But the business model hadn't fundamentally changed since the 1930s, and the company's dominant position made change seem unnecessary. No mergers, no acquisitions, no outside perspectives. The digital revolution did not arrive as a single event. It crept. Kodak actually invented the first digital camera in 1975. An engineer named Stephen Sasson built a prototype the size of a toaster that captured a black and white image at a resolution of 0.01 megapixels. The company shelved it. The fear, reasonable at the time, was that digital technology would cannibalize the immensely profitable film business. It was the kind of decision that makes perfect sense in one decade and looks catastrophic in the next. Layoffs began in the 1980s and never stopped. The generous severance packages Kodak offered in the early rounds became the seed money for new businesses started by former employees, a strange kind of forced entrepreneurship. By 2005, the University of Rochester had replaced Kodak as the city's largest employer. Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on January 19, 2012, listing some $5 billion in assets and $6.75 billion in debts. It emerged from bankruptcy in 2013, a much smaller company focused on commercial printing. By the end of 2016, it employed roughly 1,600 people locally. Bausch Lomb went through its own restructuring. The garment factories closed or moved one by one. In June 2023, the last Hickey Freeman garment rolled off the production line at the factory on North Clinton Avenue, closing out 124 years of continuous production. The factory still operates. It now produces suits under the name Rochester Tailored Clothing and holds contracts with the U.S. military, but the brand, now owned by a licensing company, sends its production to Mexico. A wooden sign still arches over the old factory entryway. Keep the quality up. Sibley's department store, the anchor of downtown, the place where families came at Christmas to see the window displays, lasted in its building until 1989. It was rebranded as Kaufmann's, then eventually absorbed into Macy's. The building itself, 1.1 million square feet, occupying an entire city block, sat largely empty for years before being redeveloped into a mixed-use complex of apartments, offices, and small businesses called Sibley Square. It's a good project, but it is not a department store. Between 2007 and 2018, the real GDP losses from Kodak's decline canceled out the growth in all other sectors in the Rochester economy. The city's population, 332,488 at its peak, had fallen to roughly 211,000 by the 2020 census. Eastman Business Park, once the world's largest photographic manufacturing facility, now houses more than 100 tenant companies on its 1,200 acres, producing everything from lithium battery recycling to biomaterials. The power plant still runs. The water treatment system still works. The private railroad tracks are still there. The infrastructure George Eastman built for one purpose has been repurposed for 100 others. The Kodak Tower still stands at 343 State Street. 19 stories of terracotta, the fourth tallest building in Rochester now. The neon Kodak sign still glows red at night, visible from the outfield seats at Frontier Field, where minor league baseball games play out under the lights. Seat number 48 in the Eastman Theater mezzanine was restored and recovered during a renovation, but never renumbered. At the grand reopening in 1972, every seat in the house was filled except that one. Nobody sat there. Nobody was asked to. The chandelier, 14 feet across, 20,000 pieces of crystal, 2.5 tons, still hangs from the ceiling, exactly where it was the night the theater opened, on Labor Day, 1922, when Rochester believed its work would never be done.